probably thought you knew a lot about negotiation. Well, that completely changed in 2016 when Chris Voss released Never Split the Difference. Coming from a background of working in the FBI, but more specifically a hostage negotiator, the tips and the insight that were given in this book completely changed the way we looked at negotiating. I was really fortunate to sit down with Chris and have a conversation about the book, about himself, and also some practical tips on how you can become a monster negotiator. Chris, thank you so much for joining us. I'm very, very excited about this.
Hey, I am happy to be here. Thank you for having me on.
No problem at all. Well, look, without further ado, why don't we jump straight into things then? Where I'd love to start is the sort of conception of the book itself, right? So, at what point did you realise, you know what, I'm onto something here, and this would make a really, really good book? How did that actually come about of turning your incredible experience, both in terms of the FBI and what you know about negotiation, and thinking, I'm actually going to turn this into a book?
Yeah, well, it was a multi-stage process. I mean, the first thing was, while I was still an FBI hostage negotiator, going through Harvard Law School's negotiation course, and then just applying my hostage negotiation techniques to the law school students at Harvard. And I assumed that there was something different about the two things. Somehow hostage negotiation was this sort of back alley brawling with no rules, and business negotiation was, formal boxing, Marcus of Queensberry rules, whatever. And I did really well. I mean, I did really well there. And the people on the staff said, "Look, you're doing the same thing we're doing. It's just the context is different, but it's the same dynamics." So I really started thinking about it then, started believing that it was applicable. And then a couple of years later, I'm back, I'm working on a master's degree up there, and the staff reached out to me and he said, "Why don't you come teach with us?" I'm like, all right, cool. So, started teaching it. And then as soon as I left the bureau, I had the opportunity to teach in a business school. And at that point in time, my son Brandon is teaching alongside me. We really think we're on to something, and we get a lot of encouragement to write a book, but we wanted to make sure we really had proven the process. So the business school that we're teaching in were part-time MBA students, and part-time means they had jobs during the day. So, we say, okay, so use these skills in your job at work and come back and write papers about how it went down. So when we felt like we had the process end to end, that's when we engaged in the book.
Really interesting because I guess, I remember first hearing about the book. It was actually a conversation in the pub with someone, and they were telling me about like a former FBI hostage negotiator. And whenever new sales books come out, often there's the kind of, all right, another book on negotiation or another new sort of
Right.
sales framework or whatnot. What was it about your book specifically, do you think, that stood out amongst the white noise and the usual kind of, the sort of crap you get within sales? What do you think it was that really stood out?
Well, I think the idea to start with that, came from an FBI hostage negotiator. That's an interesting starter. But there'd been a hostage negotiator. NYPD had a guy, Dominic Messina, who was a phenomenal hostage negotiator. He wrote a book that he applied to business negotiation, but he didn't really lay it out step by step. It was kind of like, here, try this stuff and see if it works. The fact that, our business school students had used the techniques in everything from fundraising to literally $1 billion deal on Wall Street to closing everything, personal negotiations. They use them in everything. And so we had all these specific proof of concept of and the dialogue. I mean, people really like dialogue. I can give you a skill and I could say, all right, so labels when you make a verbal observation, it seems like, it sounds like, it looks like. And that's sort of conceptual. But then in a business negotiation with a contractor who's failing, and my student says to them, "Sounds like you have a reason for not doing the work." And the contractor, instead of denying it, because the label hits the brain in a really specific psychological way, if you will. And instead of that being confrontational, the contractor hung his head and said, "No, I really don't." And it completely was a turning point in the negotiation. So we put all these negotiations that showed that it worked in all these contexts. And I think people really appreciate a lot of specific dialogue so they kind of get it in their head. They can launch and then they could take off. If you see enough good dialogue using the skills, then pretty soon you can embrace it and make it work yourself.
Were you surprised by the reaction to the book, of how successful it was, and how it sort of translated so well into the world of business and sales specifically?
Yeah, I got to tell you, yeah, very much so. And the number of people in sales in particular that have gotten back to us and said, this is the greatest sales book anybody ever wrote. It was originally thought it would go mostly at business executives, not necessarily sales, but hopefully sales would get something out of it. And I've probably got more traction in the sales community than anywhere else, and really surprised and happy. And then the fact that, I mean, it's still ranked, it still leads the business category 5 years later. That's really gratifying.
And it's had a tremendous effect on the world of sales almost specifically. And it's one of those things that's become part of common vernacular now when we talk about sales and being a sales trainer again as well. It's like, it's become almost the handbook for helping with negotiation. But I guess what I'm always interested in, and I like to ask my guests this because I think it's a really important question, is that when something new comes out, what often happens is everyone starts trying it, right? So everyone's using it on clients to the point
Right.
where it always becomes a common language for the clients as well. Even though they know what you're doing and they're meta to the situation, there becomes almost sort of like oh, I get what you're doing. You're using never split a difference on me, or you're using spin selling on me, or you're using whatever it may be. Is there a danger of diluting the effect of it by it being so widespread and it also being common knowledge to the clients that we sell to, or even the human beings that we sell to?
Yeah, that's a great question. We get that question a lot. And the real issue is the whole design of the book from the very beginning was how to create a collaborative process, regardless of how adversarial the other side felt they were towards you. And of course, if I'm in a hostage negotiation with a terrorist, they're going to feel like we're adversaries.
Yeah.
But I have to create collaboration. And as crazy as it is, hostage negotiators, we have reputational issues. We get long-term relationships because the bad guys, you can't get a reputation as a hostage negotiator for not delivering on whatever the agreement is. It was a bad guy that was holed up in a siege in Baltimore a number of years ago. The negotiator that got on the phone with him was a little rattled to start out with. It was the biggest siege in the history of the city of Baltimore, as a result of the largest manhunt in the history of the city of Baltimore. And so the negotiator's a little rattled, and the bad guy literally says to him on the phone, "You're not doing a good job. You're supposed to be establishing a rapport with me." Now, he says that because he'd been barricaded previously, and the negotiator that had gotten on the phone with him established rapport and delivered on all his promises, didn't lie about anything. So hostage negotiators have reputational concerns, and that's one of the reasons why it applies so much to business, and also why it's okay for people to know you're using the Black Swan method, the tactical empathy skills, because you're going to live with everything you say,
Mm.
and the other side's never going to feel betrayed.
It's really interesting, really, really interesting actually. So even though someone may be meta to the situation, the principles inside it are still as valuable and still as effective. But let's talk about negotiation itself then, right? Can someone be naturally good at negotiation without actually even being able to label it? What makes someone inherently good at negotiation, regardless of the situation?
The real thing is whether or not you're coachable. Daniel Coyle wrote a book called The Talent Code, and Coyle's contention is nobody's naturally good at anything. We start at ground zero when we're born, and then it's nurture from that point on. Now, I'm not sure whether it's completely that case, but a lot of times people that are naturally good at stuff, they got interested early. They probably had a success, maybe an accidental success, something caught their attention, and they started getting good at it before anybody realized that they were interested. And then suddenly, when people saw that they were good at it, they said, "Oh, well, you're a natural."
Mm.
No, they've just been interested in it for a while and thinking about it and developing it. And that the real issue is, how coachable are you? I wasn't before I started negotiation. I wasn't a good listener. I was a SWAT guy. We didn't listen to anything. We want only words we wanted to hear was "I give up." But I think I was always really coachable. And so then, since I was interested in learning, and I love to learn, now you could coach me. And if you tell me the right way to do something, I'll try it. Because I'm willing to take a risk. I know if I listen to the right people, your advice is worth it. I just got to be listening to the right people. So it's, are you coachable? Will you listen to the coaching? Will you implement the coaching? Then you can get good at it.
It's really cool. I really, really like that. I'm a big believer in that, as you say, anyone can do anything, right? Providing they've got the right mindset and they're coachable for doing that.
Right.
One of the most common questions I get asked, right, as a sales trainer when it comes to negotiation specifically is that, my clients are SaaS businesses that are based throughout the world, right? And when it comes to a negotiation that's based on two very different cultural profiles, right? Even you and I now, right? I'm an Englishman, you're an American. Culturally, we're very, very different, despite the fact we even speak the same language. Are any specifics around when you're dealing with different cultures and different languages, how that actually affects the negotiation and the different tactics you should use?
Well, the culture that we grow up in is layered over another culture, and that's the human culture. So the tactical empathy is based on how we're wired as human beings, which makes it applicable if you're human.
Mm,
And it's a little bit like physiology. There's a system in the brain, different organs, including the amygdala, called the limbic system, and it operates on the same set of rules. Just like everybody has the same respiratory system, everybody has the same limbic system. If you have a heart attack and you're English and I'm Japanese. If I'm a Japanese paramedic, I can still treat you because of the basic physiological makeup. And the emotional system of a human being is very much the same way. It's that way regardless of gender, ethnicity, or religion. Now, your culture gets layered on over it,
mm,
but what you really need is with tactical empathy, which is human based, it gives you a lot of latitude for mistakes. Like if I'm genuinely trying to understand you based on an empathic approach, when I make a mistake, you'll forgive me for it. And in my feedback loop in the interaction, I'm always looking to be corrected anyway. Part of empathy is here's where I think you're coming from. Help me understand where I'm wrong. So
mm,
empathy is really seeking correction on a regular basis. So when I do make a mistake, instead of being afraid of being corrected, I know that it actually makes our relationship better. So yeah, if I'm an American, I am going to make mistakes with you because you're an Englishman.
mm,
But you'll forgive me for it because I'm not trying to push my culture on you. I'm trying to understand your culture.
mm. That's really interesting. Fundamentally, the cultural thing shouldn't really affect the negotiation because of the basics of what you're talking about there, and the human relationship that we have actually trumps in many ways all of those
Yeah.
layers of culture, language, and whatnot. That's really fascinating. And I've often considered myself a bit of a sales historian, right? A bit
All
obsessed with
right.
the kind of history of selling. I'm really keen to get your perspective on this, and it's slightly off topic, but how do you think negotiation, in your experience, has actually evolved? Now, I know a lot of what you're talking about is almost immutable truths, right? Like, you talk about the science behind it, which isn't going to change. But culturally, how do you feel negotiation has changed over the years, even to up in your book, which was like a seismic shift in the way negotiations taking place in business now?
Yeah, I think there's always the influence of practitioners versus the academics.
Mm,
One of the early negotiation books, Herb Cohen, You Can Negotiate Anything. Herb was a practitioner like the 1980s. And then shortly thereafter, the academics start wading in, getting to yes. all the stuff that was written out of Harvard. And, they were trying to explain it from an academic perspective, have it be intellectually flawless. And people were really being driven by trying to adapt that. When I was a hostage negotiator early on, like everybody read Getting to Yes that wanted to get better at negotiation. And here's two things that were always true. They always said Getting to Yes was extremely insightful and thought provoking. And I never heard anybody say they made a deal based on what they wrote in Getting to Yes
Interesting.
simultaneously. And so, but then that was dominating principally the vast majority of the literature. There was some good ideas out there from practitioners, but they weren't writers, so their books weren't getting a lot of traction. And it's almost a cliche. A top performer is very rarely good at coaching it. Like in professional sports, in any sport, the best coaches were only fair as players, and they had to work so hard to study it. So they studied it so hard they could coach it. And then so the performers weren't writers. And then Jim Camp comes along, and in 2002 he writes Start with No. Getting to Yes is sort of the book. And I remember literally passing a bookstore and seeing this book that said Start with No. And I'm a hostage negotiator. I do a double take. I mean, Start with No. I thought you were supposed to get the yes. And that book was that really Camp's book really impacted everybody's thinking. And the first real issue in any business person's life, sales or negotiation, how do you grapple with yes versus no? That's a major turning point. As soon as you lose your fear of no, you have just stepped into a higher level of thinking and performance. And then I ran across Camp's book. I read it. We started applying his ideas in hostage negotiation. I reached out to him. We collaborated. And then, I got to tell you, one of the biggest reasons that Never Split the Difference has had the massive impact that it has is because we brought in a superstar business writer, Tal Raz, who is the business book writer. Now, I wouldn't read a children's book that he wrote because he's not a children's book writer, but he's a genius business writer. And that's what I, as a practitioner, and my son, we needed as practitioners, somebody could write it so that people would absorb it, and also, they'd hear my voice. I mean, everybody that's read the book said, "Man, that sounds like you. That I can hear your voice in that book," and that was because of Tal Ross, genius writer.
Do you consider that your mark on the earth then? That book is so monumental. Do you consider it like your the thing that you've left on the earth?
It'll probably end up being that way. Yeah, yeah, it's kind of a cool thing. Yes, I do.
It's really cool. It's really really cool. It must be quite humbling though at the same time, right? To realize that you've completely influenced an industry.
Yeah, well, it's gratifying. In hostage negotiation, if we did any good, I always felt like it was a privilege because I was helping people, I was saving lives. I mean, literally, and reclaiming lives. And the gratification in the business world is people are having better lives, but not at the expense of others. It's two really important things. Life-changing deals are a routine matter of course from people that we coach. I mean, every single week, somebody we coach says, "This deal is going to change my life." They never say, "Boy, I took them to the cleaners. I had them over the barrel." Again, what's not there is really important. It's never at anybody else's expense. I was at one of those. I got invited to a reception in Scottsdale, Arizona, just a couple weeks ago. One of those new private jet companies. They're inviting people out to the hangar. They're trying to get people to come out. So the owner read Never Split the Difference and talked about how he built his company using the concepts. And his top salesperson standing next to him said, "I read it, and that's how I negotiated my employment agreement with this guy." which meant that neither one of them resented the outcome. And that thing is really, that's where the real satisfaction comes from.
Yeah, and again, it's that kind of that idea that both parties are getting value in it as well, right? I think that's the key thing, right? And I love the way you use the term collaboration during this. It's so key, right? In a negotiation, is that you are collaborating in that process. Do you miss the? I mean, obviously they're very very different, right? From what you're doing now in your consultancy, where you're helping people close these deals, and for what you're doing before around negotiating hostage situations. I'm sure they have different spikes of adrenaline. Do you ever miss that side of it though, from the FBI and the hostage negotiation?
No, I'm grateful it happened. It's chapters. Grateful that things happen. I was grateful for my 20s. I wouldn't go back to my 20s. I'm happy with where I'm at now. So yeah, I'm really grateful. I don't miss it. I mean, for a variety of reasons, I was there at a zenith time. I was very lucky, and if any, and the time passed as I was getting out. I mean, there was some seismic changes in my world at the time, negative ones, and at that point in time, I'd come to realize that something negative is a sign to move on, because all the best things in my life came as a result of what might be construed as a negative occurrence. I mean, I'm a hostage negotiator because I tore up my knee. Thank God I tore up my knee. So, and then I became full-time hostage negotiator because I got passed over for promotion when I was in the New York division of the FBI. And so I got passed over for promotion and went a different direction. Life got better. So life gets better in its own way every decade.
It's interesting. So it was almost the. But that says a lot about the character, though, right? Is that these things that happen to you, you made an opportunity of those things, and you've made a success of it, which is, again, without being too gushing, right? Is testament to the character of you yourself. Um,
Thank you. That's kind of you to say.
No, that's okay. That's absolutely fine. I guess to wrap things up, I just want to ask you a couple of questions specifically because people are going to be watching this going. This is really interesting. Like loving learning about the book, loving learning about you. What practical tips um, would you give someone when it comes to negotiation? I know you've probably been asked this a million times before, but if you can distill it down into one or two things that are going to completely move the needle on the way that they negotiate, be that mindset or be that things that they can actually do, what would that be?
Yeah, well, maybe two things. I mean, let the other side go first. I mean, hear other people out. Now, if you're not used to doing that, if you're making your value proposition, if you're, the 10 points why somebody should buy your product, if your sales process, your sales pitch that you've worked really hard on, it's hard to not lead with that unless you've been practicing in other kinds of conversations where you realize that you gotta listen for the black swans, the tiny little pieces of information that'll change everything. So small stakes practice for high stakes results. In your personal conversations, get into practice of letting the other side talk first. You got to get your comfort level in low stakes before you put it in high stakes. And then secondly, stop being a hostage to yes. I mean, people are so desperate to hear yes that they're often actually really exploited by that and misunderstandings. Like I used to ask business people all the time, have you ever heard a yes only to find out later it was no? Well, you're only listening for yes. I mean, you become the hostage of yes. So if you can start hearing people out and no longer be the hostage of yes, you can then begin to make an immediate difference in all your conversations, and then your sales conversations, your business negotiations will flow in a different direction. I will tell you, we have a business coach who runs EOS, Entrepreneurial Operating System. He finally let us teach him tactical empathy just this year. And he was making a lot of money before. So he's like, why do I need to change? I'm making a lot of money. Not only is he making more money now, but he said, I see the world completely differently. It's not as adversarial as it was. It's actually more enjoyable. And that's what ends up happening. I mean, you're going to enjoy whatever you do for a living even more.
It's such a great point. And for me, like particularly when training young people, I find it really interesting that people separate their role as a salesperson and their role as a human being. And the reality is that those two things are exactly the same. The way you communicate in your personal life, the way you behave, the way you speak, the way you present yourself and articulate yourself should not be changed or be a facade when you're talking to a client. And that's really interesting that you're saying not only when you go into this are you going to find that your ability to sell gets better, but your personal relationships and the way that you interact with the world outside of work gets better as well. I mean, why would you not read this book, right? That's the question.
Yeah, and I can understand why a lot of people think it's two different things, but you're never going to excel at either one if you're trying to be two different people.
Yeah. The question I always ask young people is, who's better at selling, you or the person you're pretending to be? Probably you.
Probably you, yeah. Be your genuine self.
That's awesome. Well, what's the next big thing on the horizon for you then, Chris? Because obviously, you know, you've got your consultancy now. I see you talking all the time. I know you've got little keynote speeches and whatnot. What's the next big thing that you're striving for and is on the horizon for you?
Well, we got a couple of supplemental books we're getting ready to put out. You know, we're working on a book for negotiation for real estate professionals. We're probably 2.5 years away from a follow-on book to Never Split the Difference, but really from my son's perspective and what we've learned since. And so, you know, we're continuing to evolve this stuff. I mean, we've gotten the ability to learn is the only sustainable competitive advantage. And we have continued to build out this process and make it even more effective. And really, every year is a new year for us as we get better at this stuff.
That's really cool. Well, that's very exciting, and I look out for that. And if anyone wants to follow your work or wants to get in touch with a consultancy, what's the best way of keeping in touch with you and the wonderful insights you've got?
Yeah, blackswanltd.com is a website. BlackSwanLTD.com. There's two things to look for there. First of all, we got a ton of free material. A lot of free material to help you get started, get your foundation under you, and not have get it for free. We got a weekly newsletter that comes out that's actionable. You go to the website, you find on the upper right hand corner of the tabs it says the blog, the negotiation edge. The fact that it's free is not where its value is. The fact that it's concise and actionable, that's the real value. A lot of people get a long way, build a great base, which is the book and the stuff that we put out for free. And then when you're ready for the more higher speed stuff, but you got to have a good base, we'll meet you where you are to teach you the Black Swan method.
That's awesome. That's really, really cool. Well, look, Chris, all I can do is thank you. It's been really great to meet you, really great to talk to you. And anyone out there who hasn't read the book yet, I fully recommend going and buying it because it's an awesome read. And as you can tell, there's so much to learn. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
This interview was proudly brought to you by MindTickle. MindTickle is a sales readiness and conversational intelligence platform designed to help modern enablement leaders focus on behavioural change, but more importantly, drive business outcomes. I've been in sales enablement for many, many years. I'm very conscious about who I choose to sponsor a video like this, and I'm very, very proud to have MindTickle as a partner purely because of the quality of their platform, the quality of their service, and ultimately the value that it brings to the enablement community. Hope you enjoyed.